Back then we weren't talking about mental health. We weren't talking about the invisible stuff of, arthritis, nervous system pain, tingling, numbness. 200%. The best way that you can protect yourself is if you receive any shocks, make an appointment with your doctor and have him document it. Quite simple, document it.
Today we are speaking with John Knoll, who has been in the electrical trade for nearly 20 years. John is on a mission to raise awareness on long-term consequences of electrical shock exposure and spreads the word of his mission through speaking at various conferences and on social media channels. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a while since I've been able to tell my story, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, that's exactly, I guess, where we'd want to start. Just bring us back to maybe when you first started in the trade and kind of go from there. So go ahead.
I got into the trade end of 2005, early 2006. I think the Blue Book says end of 2005. And it was residential that I started in high-rise apartments. And I'd have to say, at least here in Alberta, residential's really one of the most unsafe work sites that you can be working in, especially when it comes to electrical. I was taught it was okay to put my hands in panels. Eventually I was put into parkades where I was working on main distribution panels, and there was absolutely zero way that we could turn off those panels and be safe. We were taught that we had to send fish tapes up them, that we had to work in them live, and we were never even made aware of rubber insulated gloves with leather protectors. It just, shocks kind of were a game. When we were up, before I went down into the parkades, we would be installing light fixtures in apartments above and installing plugs, and guys would just be plugging breakers in at the same time and putting switches on. And sometimes it was a game where somebody would walk in a room and flick on a switch and they know that you're putting up a light and see if you get a zap. Because we never knew the full consequences of the injury. We never understood what happens after day 2 or day 3.
What year was that, John?
I started again early 2006 or late 2005.
2006, okay.
Yeah, I was 18, just turned 18.
So was there anything that happened at those work sites that kind of brought safety up at some point as you were progressing through your career?
In Alberta, we were really just starting to, at that time, when I first started at 18, they were getting into ladder safety, basic workplace safety. My company was a large company, but it didn't have hazard assessment forms. Those were kind of implemented during my 1 year that I was there. And I moved on to another company, a little bit smaller, a little bit more responsibilities, a lot more than I should have had when I was that age. And those habits just moved on. No one understood. We had to buy our own PPE half the time. And again, we weren't made aware of these gloves. We asked about shocks. We kind of laughed when we were in school and doing the labs, and they made us put glasses on, let alone gloves. We didn't have those even. It wasn't until I worked union in my 4th year when we learned about some electrical safety, and the focus was arc flash. Everything was arc flash back then. We asked about the shocks. The old guys just laughed. Nobody knew. Nobody cared. And yet we have all these crippled tool crib electricians and these guys that you're just wondering, like, how did he get so crippled? And ignorance is bliss, I believe.
Why do you think so much attention was on arc flash and not shock protection back in 2010?
Well, obviously, because it was visually something you can see. There's big explosions. There's guys that lit on fire. There's guys that had skin burnt off. Those are all things that you can physically see. Back then we weren't talking about mental health. We weren't talking about the invisible stuff of, arthritis and, everything else that this injury brings to you. Nervous system pain, tingling, numbness. Nobody really talked about that stuff. It was just like, hey, you're tough, go get out there. You get a shock, who cares? You move on.
So how many shocks did you get when you were working for the apartments, roughly?
Well, more than I'd like to admit. Obviously multiples the first year, like multiples in a month the first year. I'd say on average, I like to just say once a month for my career until my injury really got bad. Because, you're doing a lot of renovations, you're doing a lot of troubleshooting, you're doing a lot of service calls. You could have loose neutral shocks, you could have open, bunch of things where you're digging up in your boxes, and you're young and you're taught, it just happens. So yeah, more than I would like to admit. I was held once, and that was scary. That was one of the scariest moments of my life because you were literally paralyzed. I was held right index finger to left hand, the web in between my hand. There's a little scar that you can right here. That's where it exited. And yeah, you're completely paralyzed. You stop breathing. All your muscles are contracting, pulling, and you can't even blink. You can't even cry. You can't even whisper. You can't breathe. Eventually you run out of air, and I fell off my ladder. That's how I lived.
Mm-hmm.
And I got up.
And that was 120 volts?
347 that time.
347.
I got up. I closed the job site down. I drove to the hospital. They told me go to the University of Alberta the next day, which had the big burn ward. They said I should have technically drove myself there because that's where all the people go that get shocks or electrocutions, as they called it. But I went there the next day, and they just said there's nothing we can do. 2 years later, I lost the use of my legs 3 times.
So yeah, so what was you mentioned? I remember when we first met, you told a story of really the first time that you had realized that these shock injuries led to some very severe consequences. So would you mind sharing that story with the audience?
Well, you might have to give me more recollection. I never understood what was causing all my health issues until April of 2022 when COVID hit. I lost work at where I was working a soft job in diesel engine sales. I started phoning guys in my industry. I ended up talking to Terry Becker, who is the chair of the CSA Z462 Electrical Safety Committee. Yeah. And he started talking about this injury, about electrical injury. And he swore I had it. And he reached out to Mike Doherty, who's also on that committee. Mike sent me a bunch of information regarding Sunnybrook Hospital in Ontario. It's the only research and rehabilitation center in Canada that provides rehabilitation for electrically injured workers. And then they also sent me a bunch of other information, and one included a study called Long-Term Sequelae of Electrical Injury. After reading that and learning about this injury, I understood that this was what I was dealing with. The pattern of my health issues was written in that document very well. And that's when I really, started trying to get help for this injury, because now I knew that I knew the diagnosis. I was, the scariest thing is looking for the reason, looking for the diagnosis. And I understood what was happening. And I tried to get help. I reached out to the author of that article. She is a medical consultant for my workers' compensation board, and she said she wasn't an expert. I reached out to the Canadian Dr. Joel Fish, who was identified in that expert, and he had moved from adults to pediatrics, but he was very generous with his time, and he spoke with my doctor, and they went back and forth, and called me a carbon copy of every patient he's ever seen. And that led to my fight and my struggle to try and get help and eventually get my diagnosis. And now, it's been 3 years of me doing all my rehabilitation, me doing everything.
Right.
Without help.
So prior to that though, just maybe there's other people listening that could be going through something similar. Like, what were the symptoms that you were experiencing?
Well, there's 42 symptoms that are associated with this injury. There's 42 plus, but in that one article, they're very detailed. There's a third of them that are mental health. 50% of people that receive shocks may experience mental health symptoms like anxiety, depression, nervousness, being scared of electricity. There's a third of the 40 plus symptoms are psychological. Then there is also neurological and physical. So nerve pain, nerve damage. You can have muscle spasms. You can have fatigue, arthritis, contracture, which is the worst that I believe, which is the shortening, stiffening, and hardening of all your muscles, ligaments, and tendons.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I can't go many days without doing a hot yoga session, or I can't go more than a day without going in a hot tub. You know, I take a handful of medication to try and manage this injury. But the biggest one and the hardest one, I think, is the memory loss. You know, like I had at that time at my peak before when this injury hit me, I was 29-ish years old. I had 9 employees. I had just sold a company for 6 figures. You know, I had everything that every tradesman dreams of building up. And I remember in 2017 going to one of my workers and admitting that I forgot how to schedule, that I could no longer figure out how to put a schedule together, and asking him to do the work for me. And later realizing that I lost a lot of memories, you know. Things I can put together in my head if they're explained to me, but they are not top of mind. You know, I'll have conversations with old friends and they'll be going on about things that happened in our past. And I just kind of sit there trying to put the memory together, you know, hoping it's a true memory or it's just not things I'm hearing. You know, there was a point in my life where I reached out to my brother, my estranged brother, because I forgot what he looked like. I asked him to send pictures of him and my mom. So just imagine, you know, going through dementia and MS or cancer all at once in the prime of your life in your 30s and not understanding, and everyone not really understanding either. My wife didn't really know what was happening. You know, functionally, I look functional, but, you know, we're strong people. We like to talk about the good. So you never really mention, oh, honey, I think I'm forgetting things. I think my memory's slipping. You know, you're asking for massages, but you're not telling her that if she doesn't give you a massage, you're in the worst pain you've been in. You know, there was a moment I remember my cat sat on my lap and it hurt like hell. A little tiny cat sitting on my lap. I couldn't understand. I threw the cat off. You know, you have anger, because obviously you're going through all these changes, you're experiencing this pain, this memory loss, you're getting confused, disoriented. You get angry. You know, there's a lot that a young man can go through. And if you only knew where the loves, because it's not an injury that you just get a shock and this happens right away, or it even happens that month. Could be 2 years, could be 5+ years later, when this delayed cell death that happens throughout your body and your brain, in your nervous system, in your muscles, your bones.
As much as you can tell, John, do you figure that it takes a series of shocks, or did they do the research in terms of is it possible to get it just from one shock, or is there any information about that?
It's very unethical to do human trials in shock testing. All of the research is done after the fact. In North America, it's mostly done with IBEW members. You know, there's some tests with lab rats that have been done that I've read about. But I have heard many injured who express what I have, sometimes less, sometimes worse, from a single shock. You know, body's paralyzed halfway down the left side from leaning on a cable that was feeding a lighting transformer that was miswired, and they're tying their shoes in that single shock. Within hours later, complete left side of their body paralyzed. You know, I've talked to a woman who received a shock at a mall and her life changed. And I've also talked to another woman who has a very sad story, and She's an advocate against ECT, electrical shock therapy, because she was subjected to that. And now, over the years, she can no longer speak. Her vocal cords are not strong enough to speak. She's had her voice recreated. She's in a wheelchair, and she has good days and very bad days. So to answer that, the research shows that it can be a single shock that can cause this, but there's no definitive this shock will do it to you, because there's so many different variables in the human body, from just even the path that the current exits and enters, or enters and exits, the muscle mass of the person, because muscle is more conductive. You know, muscle, blood, nerves, tendon, those are all conductive. The more muscle mass you have, the more conductive you are. Even down to the humidity in the room that day. How much perspiration, how much does that person perspirate? So to answer that question, studies show a single shock, but there is no definitive this voltage, this duration, this frequency, this many occurrences. From what I've heard from the experts, as low as 11 volts. You know, just think about memory issues. You know, lick a battery. Are you ever going to track if you had a memory issue after licking a 12-volt battery? Probably not. But you're going to swear that it never happens.
Yeah, this is a very important message, that all the people working on and around electrical equipment out there, nobody should be thinking that they're immune to electrical shock, no matter how low the voltage, and even getting shocked once is a problem. And I guess that is the message. The
only voltage that is no voltage. The equipment needs to be de-energized, and if you do have to do live work, that's when you have to do a proper hazard assessment. You have to, you know, make sure you have the PPE, do an arc flash assessment, see if you need arc flash PPE, but you should always have shock PPE in your toolbox. You know, you should technically have 2 sets of shock PPE, so you can rotate them out every 6 months and go get it tested while you're waiting for the, you know, you have another pair while you're waiting for the test to come back. One color for one half of the year, another color for the other half of the year. It's an easy way for companies to identify if their guys are complying with the testing requirements.
Yeah, so I know you mentioned the name of this condition. I didn't quite catch it there.
It's as simple as electrical injury.
Right, but the research that they're done, I think you mentioned sequelae or something like that. Is that something that people?
Sequelae is, let me just pull up the medical definition. A sequelae. It's essentially a plural word. Sequela is a condition which is the consequence of a previous injury, where sequelae is a condition which is the consequence of previous injuries, being a plural. But it's the long-term sequelae of the injury, and that's related to symptoms that can develop after an injury as a result of a previous injury. And the medical review that, you know, is referenced by the NFPA, which is referenced by the Ontario Safety Authority, which is also referenced in some Polish studies on electrical injury, is titled Long-Term Sequelae of Electrical Injury. And it was research which was funded and the product of WCB Alberta, you know. And unfortunately, you know, they don't help people with this injury. There's evidence that their medical consultants, the lead author, actually refuted that medical review months prior to it printing. And there's case law now that states that, a decision that was made in the courts. But yet, nobody can still get help for this injury in our province yet. It's an injury that is invisible. There's no scans that can show or prove that you have this injury. It's a plethora of symptoms that happens 1 to 5+ years after receiving a shock, where there is no scan that can say, hey, you have it.
Yeah, and it's also you know, by the sounds of it, you get a shock or multiple shocks or whatever, but you know, having it over time, and it sounds like it would be very hard to pinpoint exactly, well, this happened to me 3 years ago and now I'm experiencing these symptoms. So
200%. The best way that you can protect yourself is if you receive any shocks, make an appointment with your doctor and have him document it. Quite simple. Document it. Report it to your employer and hold on to that documentation. That is the best way that you are ever going to get help, because it's an injury that takes 1 to 5+ years to happen. We all receive shocks. We have up until hopefully now where we start not receiving shocks, but there's probably 1 or 2 or multiple men in our province every day that receive a shock, that they don't report it. And eventually over time, you know, that electrical current goes through our system over and over and over again. And the primary mechanism is theorized to be electroporation, which is a simple process used in gene editing or gene therapy, where an electrical current is put between cells. In gene therapy, they inject a solution. So say if you want to get a solution into a cancer cell and kill it, and the cell's just directly in a specific area, they'll direct a solution around those cells. They'll send an electrical current through those cells. Pores open up in the cells, kind of like ping pong balls, those, you know, cold balls. The solution gets in, and then the cells die. And what ends up happening in the field is the pores can't seal up, or, you know, if it's a good solution, the pores won't seal up, because we're not dealing with 10 millivolts like you do in gene therapy. We're dealing with 120 volts. We're dealing with 60,000 times the voltage that is done in gene therapy. So when those cells open up, they can die instantly, or they can take a long delayed time to die, because as they're trying to reseal, there could be a secondary injury that causes the cell death, or the cells just exhaust because they can't do it. And eventually, as one cell dies, it depletes nutrients from the other cells, and you have this cascading cell death that I had experienced 3 times in 2017, where I lost the use of my ability to walk. And just not walk, like, I mean, like pain, like it felt like I was being crushed and ripped and lit on fire all at once. It was the worst pain I've ever experienced in my life. And if you open up cells with a single shock, and then a month later, as those cells are trying to heal, you send another current through it, how can you really figure out which shock did more damage? It's impossible. It's an industry claim, and I like to think of it as something similar to asbestos. You know, they couldn't figure out which cancer was asbestos and pinpoint asbestos to specific workplace injuries for a long period of time, until enough research was done into be able to say, hey, this is the type and this is the reason that, you know, we can say that this cancer is an asbestos related injury. Right now, that's where we're at. We have an injury that is causing damage to our workers' healths and their mental health. Not even their physical health, but their mental health is deteriorating as well. You know, memory loss and everything that comes with that, the depression, the anxiety. And we're not addressing it. You know, we're putting it under the rug and trying to say that it doesn't exist in some provinces, while other provinces have full-out adapted research and rehabilitation centers, and you can go to your doctor, submit a form in, and go and get help for this injury.
Probably a lot of people don't report it because they just don't know any better. If an electrician starts experiencing these symptoms, how would they know to connect them to electrical shocks that they've received?
200%. I'm sure there's many people that have got misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia or many other reasons for this. But do you really think that you can touch lightning and there be no consequences? Because that's what we do. We are touching lightning.
Even for you, John, like when you were going through that excruciating leg pain, like were you connecting the dots there, or were you just in complete?
I was in CES. I was in Vegas, another country. And at that point in time, the only thing that I was thinking of is stay out of the hospital and get home, you know? And then I got home and I went to my doctors, and I had done a lot of myofascial release. I've experienced similar pains throughout my 20s like this. I kind of did a lot of Yamana rolling. I had a ton of money because I had sold a company. Mm-hmm. I was able to just go and throw money at anything and see if it worked. And I didn't have to go to work because I had hundreds of thousands of dollars in my bank account at that moment. And I was very fortunate that I didn't have to go through the abuse that others do when they try to get help through a compensation system. But when I got back, I went to my doctors and they kept telling me I was healthy as a horse. I complained my knees hurt for months. I complained of all of this. And then I went running and it happened again. I was in Canmore. It wasn't that bad that time, but the third time, it wasn't just my legs. It was my body. It was my brain. I fell to the ground crying, screaming. I think my wife left that night. That was the start of our separation. It just felt like my brain was dying and my body was dying.
Are you still experiencing a lot of these symptoms, or did it get any better, or is it about the same, John?
Well, after a diagnosis, my doctor started looking for medicine that would help with nerve pain. I went, tried one medicine and tried another, and eventually I'm on a medicine regime that helps, but without the use of a hot tub, which I eventually was able to afford myself. And yoga. I do yoga 3 to 5 times a week. I go to the chiropractor once to twice a week. I try to get a massage 2 times a month. And, that's the cost of being able to function and look like you, John, or you, Victor. Right now, if you saw me, you wouldn't know I was different on the street, except when you wake up and you see how stiff I am, or I go to bed and you see the pain I'm in. The worst times of this injury are in the morning when you've been sleeping and you're so rigid, or just before you go to bed when you're exhausted and your body's inflamed. Mm-hmm. That's the worst times with this injury. The only other time that's worse is when you can't get the help you need, and COVID. Again, COVID's the reason I learned that this was not going away and it was only going to get worse, because that's when I lost access to all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty terrible here. Sorry to hear about that, John. In an effort to help people out there to receive less shocks, preferably no shocks, and avoid this terrible pain potentially, how do you think we can help people to get more awareness about the shock? Because there's a lot of information about arc flash, and like you said, there's just enormous amount of information. It's very visual, and the shock seems to be one of those hidden hazards that oftentimes people just don't respect enough.
You know what? The easiest way to prevent this injury is raise awareness. Last year, we were lucky enough that my association went national to our national body, and NETCO, the formation of the IBEW and the Electrical Contractors Association of Canada, launched the inaugural Electrical Injury Day of Recognition, where we nationally started to raise awareness on this, and we stepped up to the table and said, wait, this is real. We have people that we know in our association in the past and the present who are suffering from this injury, as there is multiple people in our association I know of that have this injury. Inspectors, educators, foremen, project managers to some degree, because it's not all the same. Not all the same path, not all the same duration, not all the same current.
Yeah. Do you think putting something into the education system for electricians, warning them of how dangerous the trade can be if they skip a simple step of using the shock gloves, do you think that could have a benefit to the workers? Because you probably were completely unaware of the hazards, just like you said, and it's probably still happening today that electricians get out of the gate and eager to jump into the trade, and they don't want to say no. They would be timid to shut the panels down, and if the company does not have a very high safety standards, then potentially they're going to get shocks.
Well, one word of advice that I can say is you're going to get the best safety education, honestly, becoming a unionized member. They are about safety, and that is the one place that I can see that if you went to join, that you would be educated on the consequences. As I said, they've supported the Electrical Injury Day of Recognition, and also the private contractors have. But I can't guarantee the private contractors are all going to, be able to or will bring this to the attention of their workers. I know that in Alberta, we are putting it into the coursework that we do, but you won't learn about that coursework until a year after being in the trade. At that point of time, it's most likely already too late, or you've developed some bad habits that you're going to have to really break and hope that 5 years down the line, your body's not riddled with arthritis. When I was 20, I have medical reports going to a chiropractor and complaining that I had arthritis and diffuse pain and nervous breakdowns. And I had a functional exam, 25% out of 100, but that was 2 years after getting into the trade. I really needed that before, and that's why my biggest word of advice to anyone listening is go work for a union right now, or go work for an oil and gas or an industrial, but you gotta look out after yourself, because when it comes down to it, you're the only one that is going to look out after yourself. Good luck trying to get guys 3-7 years later to talk on your behalf and testify for you. I was very lucky that I've held connections like that, and I was able to have multiple workers come forward and provide testimony. But not everyone's lucky.
Mm-hmm. So right now, I guess where are your efforts in raising awareness? And I know you mentioned a charity. If you wanted people to kind of help out or get on board, where can they find out more about that?
Well, right now, there's nothing that they can get on board with. If you're looking for information, Google Electrical Injury Day of Recognition, or look at the Chicago Electrical Trauma Research Institute website, cetri.org, Chicago Electrical Trauma Research Institute, so CETRI.org, I believe. They have a lot of information on their website. The Sunnybrook Hospital of Ontario has a little bit of information on their website. But Electrical Injury Day of Recognition is where to start in terms of the charity that I am pushing. The initiative that I'm pushing is, as a past president of the Edmonton chapter of the Electrical Contractors Association, I had made a motion earlier this year to look at forming a charitable organization utilizing members that we have within our organization. It would be separate from our organization because the type of charity or the type of nonprofit that they are, we can't be a charity. So we would have members open a charity, and then we would be eligible to do AGLC casinos once every 18 months. And those can raise $80,000 to $100,000. And eventually, that's the goal, is raise money for research and rehabilitation in Alberta. We can open an Edmonton chapter, or an Edmonton charity, a Calgary charity, and a Northern Alberta charity. And we can start raising funds 3 times every 18 months and donate that money towards hospitals. So guys across our province can get help, and not even workers, anybody, because electrical workers aren't the only ones that suffer from electrical injuries. All trades have electric hazards. Multiple guys. I know pipe fitter in New Brunswick, and a sprinkler fitter. He got held up on a sprinkler line, and he's fighting against his workers' compensation system, fighting to get help, fighting to get recognition, fighting to go see the experts and get, them to assess him. So the goal of this charity would be to essentially, for any Albertan, could be a child, because children are at risk of electrical shocks. It could be a worker, It could be somebody in an office building that experienced it, but it's any Albertan to try and just study this injury more within our province and, you know, introduce those people to the experts and, you know, develop this network where people can be connected with survivors like me, people that have experienced the full sequelae, and they can provide the support and say life can get better. You know, right now it's bad. Right now it might be going to get worse for another year. You might not be at the worst of it yet, but just know that it will eventually get better. And instead of them searching for answers of what helps, being able to connect them with people that know about this injury so they don't have to say the same thing that I've had to say to 1,000 people. When they go and talk with the psychiatrist understands the injury. You know, that's my goal and my dream for this charity, is just to really collect data on the injured, connect them with their hospitals and research facilities, and for those that are workers, advocate on their behalf so they can receive the compensation and the help that they need and their families need. Because this isn't an injury that just affects the worker. This is an injury that will rip your family apart.
And the fact that medical professionals won't even recognize it adds even more pain and insult to already existing terrible condition. I can't imagine what it would be like going out round trying to prove to people that you have a legitimate injury and problem and they don't take it seriously. I think that alone would be traumatizing experience in by itself.
Let alone if you had cancer. You would get set up with help. You would have rehabilitation programs. You'd have social workers. You would have this system that helped you move through that process. Right now with electrical injury, you go into a hospital, there's no help. You know, I screamed in pain until I was thrown out of a hospital, escorted out by security guards because they said, there's nothing we can do for you and you're causing a ruckus. You're a malingerer.
Wow.
So yeah, it's an injury that some days, and you know, I've lost my mother, I lost to cancer. But some days when you're hopeless and there's no one to talk to and you've just been kicked out of a hospital or your doctor doesn't believe you, some days I wish this was cancer.
Well, this has been really good, John, and I want to thank you for coming on the show. This is definitely an extremely important message, and you know, we'll do our part by making sure that as many people hear this as possible. If someone did want to reach out to you, and maybe they have, you know, they're suffering from some of the similar symptoms, and they're looking for some help, what's the best way to get a hold of you? Is that probably on LinkedIn or?
My email or LinkedIn. I'll tell you my email because that's how you can find me on LinkedIn as well. But it's all one word. First name, last name, and then 3 letters. So JohnKnollPEC@gmail.com. And that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay. Thank you, John, for sharing your very important story. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks for helping raise their awareness. Cheers.